Wonderful to see you all. It's a great honor to be able to welcome you this morning, Your Excellencies, distinguished participants and panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Really a singular honor to welcome you all here. We're trying to start on time because we have a fairly full schedule and we want to give you maximum opportunity to enter into the discussion and the debate on the Global Compact. This is the second session of this year's International Dialogue on Migration. This is a series that started in the year 2000, has continued, and to grow in interest and importance. We're particularly honored to see so many of you here, representatives of governments, of the academic world, local authorities, the Geneva Diplomatic Corps, representatives of civil society, the private sector, and in particular migrants from all corners of the world. Really honor and pleasure to welcome you. As I think you know from the program, we have a specific focus this year, both in April in New York and now here, on understanding migrant vulnerabilities. We're talking about a solution-based approach to a global compact that reduces vulnerabilities of migrants and tries to empower them. Now, I think to set the scene in a brief introduction, this is a particularly crucial moment. First of all, a time when member states and all other relevant actors are involved in the consultation phase of the Global Compact on Migration. As you know, we're just going next week on Monday and Tuesday to New York for the fourth thematic session. We're coming in now on the heels of the New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants that was adopted by member states at the UN General Assembly on the 19th of September last year. And we are coming to this dialogue today at a time when the international community is already on a new path toward cooperation and action towards safer, more orderly and regular migration. Now, at that New York summit, which a number of you attended, member states made some very important commitments to strengthen the global governance of migration. First of all, by bringing IOM into the UN system after 65 years operating independently but in collaboration with the UN. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, through the development of a global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration, in addition to a global compact on refugees. And we're coordinating very closely with our traditional partner, UNHCR, to make sure we're keeping one another informed and we're going forward together on both of these compacts. Now, we have a lot to build on. We didn't start yesterday. This goes back at least 20 or 30 years. And more recently, in 2015, we had 4 or 5 major agreements, which, by the way, constituted one of the incentives for IOM to become part of the UN system. First of all, we had the most important one, of course, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This is an agenda that was approved in September of 2015. We already had in March of that year the Disaster Risk Reduction Framework in Sendai, Japan. In July, of course, we got the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development. And then, of course, in December, the Paris Climate Change Agreement. But we also have a whole body of international human rights law and labor standards, and we have international transnational criminal law. So all of these agreements and norms give us a pretty solid basis for consulting on and negotiating a global compact on migration. But I think we have to say, and I use the word advisedly, that we have an historic opportunity. This is what I've been calling a rendezvous with history, because it's not likely to come our way again. And a lot of people's well-being and even their lives depend on what we can all do to establish this global compact. There's just an awful lot of people out there on the move who are very vulnerable. They're not covered by any international legal framework. Not that this is likely to be such an international framework or binding agreement, but we need some common understandings and commitments that say we want to give these people attention and support. Now, the Global Compact invites us to do a number of things. First of all, to move away from the currently reactive, unidimensional, populist, and very toxic approach to migration governance, in which migration has become a negative word, despite an entire history of migrants' contributions to all of our societies. We're there also, we want to reach a consensus on a comprehensive, long-term, multifaceted policy on migration. We want migrants to be able to move in a safe, orderly, and dignified way. And we want governments to be able to manage migration much more humanely and responsibly than in the past. And we believe that if we reach that consensus, that shared responsibility will create shared opportunities, because we know the contribution that migrants make. I'll give you one statistic. The latest McKinsey Global Institute report on migration says that although migrants still constitute only about 3% of the world's population, they're producing 9% of global GDP, and they're producing 4% more of GDP than they would have had they stayed home. So we're expected to achieve a couple of objectives: a comprehensive framework, fill an important gap, and reach a global agreement on human mobility and foster deeper collaboration. So I want to make, just with that introduction, a couple of points. First of all, the importance of cooperation. This is at the very heart of any global compact. We need to build on the conclusions of the first workshop that was held in New York on the 18th and 19th of April at UN headquarters. Those discussants at the time pointed out repeatedly that it is really through cooperation that we will succeed in this framework, and that the migration governance has to be consistent and coherent with human rights obligations and standards. They also said we need to do more to understand the driving forces of migration, how to build a comprehensive and coherent approach to migration, how to ensure its effective implementation. That will be extremely important, and make sure that these commitments are followed up on through a proper implementation and monitoring mechanism for the Global Compact. Second point is we have to avoid the risk of exclusion. The IDM that I'm opening now today is going to build on these discussions in New York, where we're going to deal with the important subject of migrants in situations of vulnerability. And here I think it's important we make a fundamental distinction, or we won't get it right these 2 days. A carefully crafted directive from the New York Declaration and the recent reminder at our own standing committee, we are speaking of migrants in vulnerable situations. We are not speaking of vulnerable migrants. Now, perhaps that distinction will escape you as it did me on first reading, but it's a very important distinction, because we're not speaking of creating a new category of migrants called vulnerable migrants. Anybody on the move is vulnerable. We know that. We're speaking of migrants in vulnerable situations, how we can understand that better in order to support them. So, while some migrants may be inherently vulnerable, such as, for example, the exponentially growing phenomenon of unaccompanied minors and unaccompanied children, separated children from their parents, they are truly vulnerable. The focus is primarily on, first of all, what are the situations that create vulnerability for migrants? At which stage in their migratory journey do they become vulnerable? And it can happen at any or even at all stages, including after arrival. And how are these vulnerabilities, how can they be reduced or eliminated, and by whom? I hope all of us. But if the agenda background paper inadvertently suggests something otherwise, then I would ask you to understand the discussion in the terms that I've just tried to outline and explain. So the overall objective is therefore to address all the aspects of vulnerability that migrants experience and the challenges that this involves. So we need in these 2 days to do several things. To try to understand better situations of vulnerability for migrants, to try to identify vulnerability and assess the causes, to review the protection systems available to international migrants, and to foster consensus on our policies in response to vulnerability, and to propose some frameworks to prevent, address, and sustainably resolve migrant vulnerability. Final question, and then in order not to go on too long, is to suggest some paths, some pathways to solutions. 4 or 5 of these. Let me go through them very quickly. First one is to avoid assuming or characterizing all migrants as victims, a point I made earlier. We look at the specific needs of certain migrants, such as children, the disabled, or trafficked migrants, or smuggled migrants. But we need to recognize in the Global Compact how we address all of these situations. We need a holistic approach to this. The second consideration is that of making sure that this Global Compact places human rights and dignity of migrants at its very center, regardless of the status of the migrants. And we love to categorize people, but it's better not to do that when we talk about vulnerability. So this means looking, for example, vulnerability at border controls, return programs, readmission, post-return monitoring, and establishing accountability mechanisms. Third subpoint, the need to have specific policy and practical options. The fourth one, very important one, is to understand that social inclusion and community integration are absolutely crucial prerequisites for protecting migrants' rights. At a meeting I attended in Brussels yesterday, tried to make the point that almost all of the bad things that happened last year, the attacks in Paris, Nice, Brussels, San Bernardino, California, Orlando, Florida, were all homegrown. These weren't recently arrived migrants. These were nationals, badly integrated, who felt alienated and unaccepted. We can do better. We have to do better. If we're going to avoid this risk of terrorism or bad attacks, or if we're not going to deny ourselves the contribution that these migrants are going to make. And then the fifth and final subpoint is that we need to make sure that we don't just have policies and frameworks for structural vulnerability, but that we also have a means fully to implement and monitor what we committed ourselves to. Not quite sure how we do that, and I'm not trying to get ahead of anyone, But clearly, if we don't have that, we risk having a compact that will not do what you are here to discuss and want it to do. So let me, with this, stop and take my seat and introduce the next part of our program. Thank you.